The bass from the wedding band thudded through the soles of my shoes, vibrating all the way up to my teeth. I gripped my water glass tight enough that the icy condensation numbed my fingers. The air, inside the Roanoke Grand Hotel ballroom, was heavy. It smelled like spilled champagne, expensive perfume, and decaying white lilies. "You are too poor to be family," Brittany said. My sister stood 3 feet away from me. Her custom silk gown caught the light from the chandeliers. She lowered her voice to a sharp hiss, but made sure Aunt Carol, standing right behind her, could hear every word. "So, sit quietly," my 33-year-old sister continued, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at my chest. "Do not embarrass us today. Do not bring up Mom. Do not bring up money. Just eat your dry chicken and smile." Aunt Carol smirked and took a sip of her wine. A few guests nearby turned their heads, pretending they had not heard the exchange. A few feet away, our mother sat at a corner table. Margaret Whittaker looked confused, her hands folded in her lap, completely unaware that her youngest daughter was making a scene. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I had spent my entire life absorbing the shock waves of this family, and today would not be the day I lost my temper. I simply nodded, set my glass on a passing waiter's tray, and turned my back on the bride. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom fell shut behind me, muting the music. My phone felt like a brick in my pocket. I pulled the device out and dialed the number I had kept ready for weeks. "Helen," I said when the lawyer answered on the first ring. "Lauren, are you sure you want to do this now?" Helen asked. Her voice was calm and measured. "Serve her now," I said. I walked over to the glass partition overlooking the dance floor. I watched Brittany adjust her veil. She picked up a microphone, preparing for her grand toast. She looked radiant, powerful, and completely untouchable. Then the music cut off mid-note. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. A venue security guard stepped onto the dance floor, leading a man in a rumpled gray suit. The man held a thick manila envelope. He called Brittany's name loudly enough that the sound echoed off the high ceiling. Brittany smiled, looking politely confused, and took the envelope. She pulled out the first page. I watched her eyes scan the header. Her face lost all its color. The microphone slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a loud electronic squeal. Then, she screamed. The path to that moment started on a quiet Tuesday morning in early September, 6 weeks prior, in the year 2026. I sat at the kitchen table in my mother's house. The Roanoke autumn air was just starting to carry a chill, creeping through the poorly insulated window frames. Mom was asleep in her recliner in the living room. I was 39 years old. I worked as a patient transition coordinator for a rehabilitation center. When Mom's cognitive decline became impossible to ignore, I stepped back to part-time hours. I had to be here. I opened my care ledger on the table. It was a thick, black notebook. The documentation was a habit born from my profession. I tracked every medication, every doctor appointment, every meal, and every dollar spent on household care. I logged her morning dosage with my blue pen. Next to the notebook, my laptop was open. I was halfway through a module for my professional certification. I needed to finish the course, and I needed to get back to full-time work. Before I logged out of my bank portal, I transferred $20 into a separate savings account. I had named the account Next Chapter. $20 meant I would spend another winter wearing the same wool coat with the frayed cuffs. I picked up my sewing kit from the counter and started reinforcing the seams on that coat. It was a strategic choice. I needed an exit plan, even a slow one. The front door opened without a knock. Brittany walked in and dropped a heavy designer tote bag onto the kitchen island. She smelled like expensive espresso and dry cleaning. "I took care of the bathroom," she announced. She did not ask how Mom was doing. She walked straight to the coffee pot. 4 years ago, when Mom was still sharp enough to sign the paperwork, we divided the responsibilities. I became the healthcare proxy. I managed the daily reality. Brittany worked as an operations manager downtown. She liked spreadsheets, and she liked control. So, she took the durable financial power of attorney. She handled the money. "You finally hired someone?" I asked, putting down my needle. "Mom needs those grab bars installed before winter. Her balance is getting worse. Brittany waved a hand dismissively. I paid the invoice this morning. Do not worry your little head about it, Lauren. You do the nursing stuff. I handle the big picture. Who is the contractor? I asked. Just a local company, she said. She checked her smartwatch, her gold bracelets clinking together. I have to get back to the office. Honestly, you should just be glad someone in this family has actual money management skills. My sister walked out, letting the door slam behind her. I picked up my pen and logged her exact statement in the ledger. 2 days passed. On Thursday afternoon, Tessa arrived for her shift. Tessa was our part-time caregiver, a quiet woman with kind eyes. An occupational therapist had also come by to check on Mom's mobility. The therapist found me in the kitchen. She tapped her clipboard. Lauren, have the contractors given you a timeline? The therapist asked. Your mother is losing stability in her left leg. We really need those safety rails in the primary bathroom. My sister handled the payment on Tuesday, I said, wiping down the counter. She said the work was done. The therapist gave me a blank look. Tessa walked into the kitchen, carrying a stack of fresh towels. She stopped and crossed her arms. Lauren, Tessa said softly. Nobody has been here. I have been at this house all week. My stomach tightened. A cold dread seeped into my chest, heavy and dark. Let me check the files, I said. I walked into the den. The room smelled of old paper and lemon polish. Brittany kept a gray filing cabinet near the window, to prove she was doing her job. I pulled open the top drawer. I found the folder marked for home maintenance and pulled out the most recent document on top. It was a printed invoice. The header read, Whitaker Home Services. The line items were incredibly detailed. Demolition. Slip-resistant tile installation. Safety rails. Wide door framing. The total cost was nearly $25,000. Stamped across the bottom in bright red ink was the word paid. I carried the paper down the hall. My shoes squeaked slightly on the original hardwood floors. I stopped in front of the primary bathroom. The door still stuck at the bottom edge. I pushed it open. I turned on the overhead light. The exhaust fan rattled. The space was completely untouched. The old porcelain bathtub sat heavy in the corner. The slippery linoleum floor peeled slightly at the edges. There were no grab bars. There was no wide door frame. I stood in the center of the dusty room. I looked at the piece of paper in my hand. Then I looked at the bathtub. My sister had not just lied about hiring a contractor. A project worth nearly $25,000 had been paid for with our mother's money, and the bathroom did not exist. My phone camera clicked once, twice, and then a third time. I moved around the small, damp space of the primary bathroom, capturing the peeling linoleum and the ancient porcelain tub from every angle. The exhaust fan rattled overhead, pushing stale air around the room. Did anyone come to measure the doorframe? I asked, keeping my voice level as I stepped back into the hallway. Tessa leaned against the wall, holding a stack of clean towels. Her kind eyes looked troubled. Nobody has been here, Lauren. Not a single worker. I have been at this house all week. I nodded and slipped my phone into my pocket. I did not scream, and I did not call the police. I needed absolute facts, not emotional accusations. Before Tessa left for the day, I asked the occupational therapist to email a fresh copy of her original safety recommendations. I printed it out and placed it in a plain manila folder alongside the fake invoice. Later that night, the house finally grew quiet. Mom was asleep in her recliner, the television playing quietly in the background. I sat at the kitchen table with my black care ledger spread open next to the household bank statements Brittany had provided. Cross-referencing took hours, and the numbers refused to align. I had paid for 3 months of Mom's blood pressure medication out of my own checking account just to ensure there was no delay at the pharmacy. My sister's documents claimed she had reimbursed herself for those exact pharmacy runs. Another line item listed $2,000 for specialized mobility equipment. I walked into the living room, staring at the standard aluminum walker I had bought at a local drugstore for $50. There was no expensive medical equipment. My laptop hummed gently on the kitchen table. I closed the banking portal and opened my certification coursework. The glow of the screen illuminated the dark kitchen as I completed another module. Just as I was about to log off, an email notification popped up. It was an interview invitation for a full-time patient transition coordinator position at a major hospital. A small rush of adrenaline hit my chest. The position offered a salary that could finally secure a lease on a small apartment. Before closing the laptop, I logged into my personal bank app and moved $35 into the Next Chapter savings account. The balance was growing, inch by inch. Next to my chair hung a navy blue dress in a plastic dry cleaning bag. It was 4 years old, classic, and completely fine for a wedding. Brittany had demanded I buy something from a boutique downtown, something that cost a month of my grocery budget. I chose to alter the hem on the old dress instead. Every dollar saved was a brick in the wall I was building between myself and this toxic house. The front door unlocked the next afternoon. Brittany marched inside, holding a cream-colored folder. She wore a tailored beige suit that looked entirely out of place in our dusty living room. "Sign this," my sister said. She dropped the folder onto the coffee table, right next to Mom's tea mug. "It is just a standard family expense acknowledgement. My accountant says we need it for the household care records." I picked up the document. The single page summarized a vague list of caregiving costs, lumping the fake bathroom renovation together with standard utility bills. "I do not sign financial paperwork on the day it is handed to me," I said, folding the paper in half and slipping it into my pocket. "I will review it this weekend." Brittany rolled her eyes, letting out a sharp practice sigh. "You are so paranoid, Lauren. You act like I am trying to steal the silverware." "Keep the copy. I will print another one for Mom to sign." The threat hung in the air. She wanted a false consensus, a piece of paper proving we all agreed on her spending, and she was willing to manipulate our mother to get it. When my sister finally left, I pulled my laptop back out. The contractor name on the bathroom invoice read Whitaker Home Services. I typed the name into the Virginia State Business Registry. The search results loaded slowly. Aunt Carol used to run a property management and cleaning business years ago, handling tenant turnovers and minor repairs. The status on the screen flashed in bold red letters. Inactive. The business address listed was Carol's residential address over on Elm Street. The company had been closed for 3 years. A memory surfaced. Just last month, my aunt had stood in this very kitchen, swearing she wanted nothing to do with the stress of Mom's finances. The lie was sitting right there on the screen. Sunday dinner at Aunt Carol's house always felt like a performance. The dining room smelled of roast beef and floor wax. Heavy floral wallpaper trapped the heat, making the air suffocating. Mom sat next to me, quietly pushing her mashed potatoes around her plate. "Lauren looks exhausted," Carol announced to the table, pouring herself a second glass of red wine. "You need to stop hovering over Margaret. You are becoming entirely too controlling." Brittany nodded in agreement, cutting her meat with precise, tiny movements. I told her to relax. "She is just bitter because she is stuck at home." Mom looked up, her brow furrowed. "Did we go to the doctor today?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "No, Mom. Today is Sunday," I said, placing my hand over hers. I ignored the bait and looked directly across the table at the woman who owned the inactive company. "Aunt Carol, do you remember the name of the contractor who was supposed to do the bathroom? Brittany mentioned you might know them." Carol set her wine glass down a little too hard. "Oh. Yes, it was an independent guy, Johnson Contracting, very reliable." "Really?" I asked, taking a sip of water. Brittany told me it was a larger firm from out of town. My sister glared at me, the muscles in her jaw flexing. 2 different explanations. Neither of them matched the invoice sitting in my manila folder. I smiled and passed the salt. Later that evening, back in my own room, I pulled up a group email Brittany had sent to the family 2 weeks prior. It contained the master schedule for her wedding day, complete with a list of vendor deadlines to prove how organized she was. My finger traced the glowing screen. A final payment for the hotel ballroom was listed on the schedule. The amount due was $24,800. I pulled the fake bathroom invoice from my folder. The total cost for the imaginary renovation was $24,850. The date on the invoice matched the exact week the venue required their final deposit. The law office smelled of lemon furniture polish and old paper. Helen Brooks sat across from me, a gray-haired woman with a calm, unblinking stare. I pushed the manila folder across the heavy mahogany desk. It contained the fake bathroom invoice, my printed photos of the untouched tub, and a copy of the care ledger. Helen flipped through the pages, her expression remaining perfectly neutral. She did not gasp or offer false promises of an easy victory. In Virginia, your status as her biological daughter and healthcare proxy gives you standing, the attorney explained, tapping a manicured fingernail against the fake invoice. We can demand a formal accounting of her actions as the agent under the power of attorney. If she is abusing that legal right, a judge can suspend it. So we stop her today, I said, my hands gripping the edge of the leather guest chair. No. Helen closed the folder. If we accuse your sister without a watertight pattern, she will drain the accounts and claim you are simply a disgruntled sibling. We need a written disclosure request first. For now, you only collect what you legally possess. Scan your ledger. Timestamp everything. Write down conversations immediately. But do not record her without consent. I nodded, absorbing the rigid boundaries of the law. The ledger had just transformed from a personal habit into an official timeline. 2 days later, the fluorescent lights in the neurology clinic buzzed softly above us. Mom sat on the crinkling exam paper, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The doctor, a soft-spoken man with wire-rimmed glasses, asked her to count backwards by sevens. Mom stumbled on the second number. A flush of deep, painful red crept up her neck. She looked at me, her eyes suddenly clear and terrified by her own confusion. I cannot remember, she whispered. My chest ached. It was a heavy, dull pressure right behind my ribs. I reached out and squeezed her cold hand. The doctor made a quiet note on his tablet, officially recording that Margaret Whitaker lacked the capacity to understand complex financial documents. The defense of a voluntary gift was quietly dismantled in that sterile room. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket the moment we reached the clinic parking lot. Brittany's name flashed across the screen. Why did you take Mom to a specialist without consulting me? My sister demanded. Traffic noise echoed in the background of her call. Her balance is worsening, I replied, unlocking the car door so Mom could slide into the passenger seat. I am the health proxy. You are trying to isolate her, Brittany snapped. Everyone thinks you are getting paranoid, Lauren. Keep pushing, and I will tell the entire family exactly how unstable you have become. All medical decisions are documented in the patient portal, I said, and ended the call. We arrived back at the house just as the afternoon shadows stretched long across the lawn. I settled Mom into her favorite recliner with a cup of tea, then went to sort the mail scattered on the entryway console. A glossy piece of cardstock had slipped behind the table, resting on the wooden baseboard. I picked it up. It was a business card for a luxury real estate agent. Tucked inside a stack of grocery flyers was a printed email, carelessly left behind. The sender was the realtor on the card. I scanned the text, and my breath caught in my throat. The agent confirmed a schedule for staging photos, specifically requesting a Tuesday morning. Tuesday was the exact day I always took Mom to physical therapy. The final sentence of the email mentioned aiming for a quick sale right after the honeymoon. Brittany was not just draining cash to pay for a ballroom. She was preparing to liquidate the house we were standing in. I walked out to the driveway and called Helen, reading the printed email aloud. A quick sale accelerates our timeline, the attorney said. But we need to connect the missing funds to this real estate plan. The autumn wind rattled the dead leaves in the oak tree above my car. Lauren, Helen continued, her voice deadly serious. Can you survive 6 more weeks of playing the quiet, defeated sister? If she suspects you know, we lose our advantage. I looked at the house. Inside, my mother was drinking her tea, completely unaware that her golden child was planning to sell the roof over her head to cover a stolen wedding fund. I can play the part, I said. My phone started ringing the next morning. Aunt Sarah called first, followed quickly by Cousin David. The message remained identical across every conversation. Wrapped in polite Southern concern, they advised me to relax. They suggested backing off and letting the bride enjoy her special day. David even mentioned how generous it was for Brittany to cover all of Mom's medical expenses out of her own pocket. The narrative had been carefully planted. My sister was building a fortress of public opinion, painting me as the bitter, jealous sibling. Arguing with my relatives was useless, so I simply wrote their comments down in my black notebook, tracking the lies as they spread through the family tree. Daniel stopped by the house that afternoon. The groom carried a small bouquet of grocery store daisies for my mother. He set the flowers on the kitchen counter, offering a warm, easy smile. "Margaret has been so incredibly generous with the wedding gift," Daniel said, pouring water into a glass vase. "We really appreciate it." My jaw tightened. Did Brittany mention where that gift originated? He paused, the stems resting against the glass rim. "She told me your mother insisted on contributing. Look, Lauren, weddings are stressful. Try not to turn the finances into a battleground." The man genuinely believed the story he had been fed. Daniel was not a mastermind. He was just a convenient shield for the bride. Later that evening, the heavy thud of a shifting chair echoed from the living room. Mom had slipped near the edge of the hallway rug. She caught herself on the doorframe, avoiding a bad fall, but the incident terrified me. By Wednesday, Tessa and I were mounting a small wireless camera in the corner of the common area. Aunt Carol stopped by during the installation. She stood with her arms crossed, glaring at the blinking green light. "This is a massive invasion of privacy," my aunt declared. "You are spying on your own family." "It is a fall monitor," I replied, securing the final screw. "If she trips while I am in the other room, I need to know immediately." Brittany arrived an hour later and stared directly at the lens. She knew exactly what the device was, and she knew it was watching the living room. My sister sat on the sofa, scrolling through her phone. Carrying a tray of coffee, I set a mug near her designer handbag. "What kind of tile did the contractor end up using for the bathroom?" I asked, keeping my tone entirely conversational. "Ceramic," Brittany answered without looking up. "White, non-slip." The fake invoice in my manila folder specifically listed gray slate. Taking a sip of my coffee, I continued. "And the medical supplier? Did they drop off the oxygen concentrator for $2,100? "It is arriving next week," she snapped, finally making eye contact. "Right. Though I thought the receipt said 2,200. "It was 2,150, she corrected instantly. The woman who claimed she did not manage the tedious details possessed a flawless memory for the exact amounts missing from the bank accounts. The house settled into a quiet hum by Friday night. I sat beside Mom in the living room, carefully adjusting the hem on my navy blue dress. The fabric pooled across my lap. Mom watched my hands move. Her eyes held a rare moment of clarity. "You always were good with a needle. You fixed your own clothes when you gave up that college program to stay here." The words hit me like a physical blow. She remembered the scholarship I had declined years ago, treating that massive sacrifice as an expected chore. Looking at her fragile, trembling hands, I understood she was sick. I could not blame her for the past, but a quiet realization settled in my bones. My life could not remain frozen to protect this toxic dynamic. The next morning, I noticed a small purple bruise on Mom's wrist while giving her breakfast. Fear spiked in my chest. Opening the monitoring app on my laptop, I scrubbed through the previous afternoon's footage. The recording revealed no accidents. Instead, the video showed Brittany sitting beside our mother on the sofa. My sister pulled a printed page from her bag and placed it on the coffee table. "It is just a form for the bathroom repairs, Mom." Brittany's voice crackled through the computer speakers. "Does Lauren know about this?" Mom asked, her tone hesitant. "She does not need to," the golden child replied, pressing a pen into those fragile hands. The clip ended as Mom leaned forward to sign. Rewinding the video, I paused on the exact frame where the document lay flat against the table. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the pixelated header. It was not a maintenance form. The bold letters at the top clearly read reimbursement authorization. Brittany was actively forcing a confused woman to sign away thousands of dollars. The glare from my laptop screen reflected in Helen's glasses. We sat in her quiet office, listening to the tinny audio of my sister's voice playing through the speakers. On the video, Brittany pushed the reimbursement authorization toward our mother, and the lie hung heavy in the air. Helen paused the clip right on the frame showing the document. The attorney steepled her fingers, her expression completely unreadable. "This establishes misrepresentation," Helen said, keeping her voice low and even. "However, a single video clip rarely secures a suspension on its own. We need the pattern, and to get that, I am issuing a formal written demand for disclosure." We spent the next 2 days building an ironclad foundation. I pulled the public records for Whitaker Home Services, printing out pages that proved Aunt Carol's old company lacked active status, liability insurance, or any recent construction permits. Tessa signed a simple, factual statement confirming no work crews had ever entered the house. An email from the occupational therapist served as the final nail, verifying the primary bathroom remained a severe hazard. When Brittany finally responded to the lawyer's letter, she delivered a carefully curated packet of financial records. My sister clearly believed a thick stack of paper would overwhelm me and force a retreat. Instead, it gave me a map. Sitting at the kitchen table late that night, I spread the documents out under the harsh overhead light. The packet showed multiple large transfers from Mom's primary checking and investment accounts to Whitaker Home Services. The line items were aggressively labeled as renovations, specialty medical equipment, and property maintenance. Because I did not have access to my aunt's business accounts, the paper trail hit a dead end there. I could not see how the cash flowed back into Brittany's manicured hands. But I did not need to see the final destination to prove the theft. I opened the bank statement for the small joint household account, the only financial record I legally possessed. Looking at the dates, I matched my own debit card purchases for Mom's prescription refills and daily groceries to the exact weeks Brittany claimed she had fronted those costs. My sister was taking massive reimbursements for money I had already spent out of my own meager paycheck. I ran the final calculation twice, and my stomach plummeted. The total missing funds exceeded $100,000. Before the inevitable explosion happened, I needed a safety net for the most vulnerable person in the room. I spent Thursday morning on the phone with a local social worker, mapping out a contingency plan. We discussed emergency backup care and the process of appointing an independent fiduciary. To secure Mom's medication pipeline in case her accounts were suddenly frozen, I quietly diverted another chunk of my paycheck into my next chapter savings. I refused to let my mother become collateral damage in a war she could not even comprehend. The fallout from the disclosure demand arrived on Friday afternoon in the form of Aunt Carol. The front door swung open while I was typing up a patient transition summary for work. Carol marched into the living room, smelling strongly of floral perfume and unfiltered anxiety. "Why is some downtown law firm sending me formal inquiries?" my aunt demanded, throwing her leather purse onto the sofa. "You are completely out of line, Lauren." I closed my laptop and stood up, keeping the coffee table between us. "The attorney is simply asking for receipts matching the invoices from your company. If Whitaker Home Services completed the work, providing the subcontractor payroll should be easy." Carol flushed, her hands fluttering defensively. "Brittany just borrowed a little to cover some unexpected expenses. It is family money anyway. You are just bitter because you want the house for yourself." "Nobody is taking this house," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. My aunt scoffed, waving a hand in the air. "Oh, please, once the house sells, everything will balance out anyway." She promised it would all be replaced. The room went completely still. The silence stretched tight enough to snap. Carol had just admitted she knew about the missing funds, and worse, she knew about the secret plan to sell the property. She was an active participant waiting for a payout. Realizing her mistake, Carol's eyes darted nervously around the room. She shifted her weight, trying to recover her usual arrogant posture. "If you make a scene right before the wedding, the entire family will know you have lost your mind. People already think you are unstable." "I do not care what the family thinks," I replied, crossing my arms. "I care that the records match." Carol did not answer. Instead, her gaze drifted past my shoulder, locking onto the gray filing cabinet in the corner of the den. She stared at the metal drawer for a long, deliberate moment before turning on her heel and marching out the front door. A cold knot formed in my throat. I had a quick errand to run at the pharmacy, but her lingering look made me uneasy. 2 hours later, I returned home and walked straight into the den. The room felt wrong. The air was disturbed, and the faint scent of floral perfume still lingered near the window. I stepped toward the gray filing cabinet and reached for the handle. The metal lock cylinder was completely mangled, gouged out by something heavy and sharp. I yanked the top drawer open. The manila folder containing the fake invoice was still there, but the space next to it was entirely empty. My black care ledger, the physical spine of my entire timeline, was gone. I stared at the empty space in the metal drawer for exactly 10 seconds. Panic never arrived. Instead, a cold and clinical focus settled over my mind, sharpening every detail in the quiet den. Walking straight to my laptop, I pulled up the security camera footage from the hallway. The video confirmed my suspicions within minutes. Aunt Carol had lingered near the room long after our argument ended, her leather purse suddenly looking much heavier as she finally walked out the front door. The woman clearly thought destroying the physical notebook would erase the entire paper trail. She had absolutely no idea about the digital backups. Picking up my phone, I called Helen. They took the physical care ledger, I reported, watching the recorded footage loop on my screen. The lawyer let out a quiet breath. "Are you worried?" "Not at all," I replied, opening the encrypted folder on my computer desktop. "I scanned every single page and emailed them to your secure server 3 weeks ago. The theft just proves they are terrified of what those records show." We moved with aggressive precision the following morning. Helen fired off official preservation notices to both my sister and our aunt, legally mandating them to hold all financial documents. Meanwhile, a local locksmith changed the deadbolts on our front and back doors before noon. The heavy brass locks clicked into place, securing the perimeter of the house. I handed Tessa a brand new notebook so she could maintain a completely independent care schedule, and I packed all my remaining original documents into a lockbox at my personal bank. Access to my mother was now strictly restricted to approved medical caregivers and myself. The telephone rang on Thursday afternoon while I was making a pot of chicken soup. The caller identification displayed the county social services office. A caseworker on the line sounded incredibly tense. She explained that a younger relative had submitted an aggressive inquiry about admitting Margaret Whitaker into a state-funded facility, pushing for placement immediately following a honeymoon trip. The proposed nursing home sat 40 miles outside the Roanoke city limits, and it completely lacked specialized memory care. My sister wanted our mother out of the house fast so the real estate closing could proceed without any physical interference. My own exit strategy finally materialized the very next morning. The hospital recruitment office officially offered me the full-time patient transition coordinator position, and the salary they proposed changed everything. The hiring manager asked me to begin the day after the wedding. Knowing the chaos that was about to unfold, I negotiated a slight delay, pushing my start date back 1 week to ensure Mom was completely stabilized. After ending the call, I logged into my banking application and stared at the next chapter account balance. The funds were finally sufficient to cover a security deposit on a small townhouse. That money belonged entirely to me, earned through late nights and careful saving, completely untainted by family guilt. But before I could secure my new life, I had to survive the collision course set for the weekend. Friday evening brought a heavy, suffocating rain to the valley. Brittany arrived at the house to drop off a garment bag, acting sickeningly sweet. The bride leaned casually against the kitchen counter, sipping bottled water and watching me chop vegetables. "Did you ever find that little black notebook you always carry around?" she asked. Her eyes carefully searched my face for any sign of distress. "I found exactly what I needed," I replied smoothly, sweeping diced onions into a hot pan. My sister smiled a thin, victorious smile. She clearly believed my primary evidence was sitting in a dumpster somewhere. Adjusting the heavy diamond ring on her left hand, she told me to show up at the hotel ballroom the next day. Her tone suddenly shifted from casual to commanding. She ordered me to sit quietly in the corner and avoid embarrassing the family with my cheap clothes or complaints. I nodded in quiet agreement. I desperately needed to be in that room to protect our mother, and the legal team needed Brittany trapped in a fixed location. Saturday, October 17th, 2026 dawned gray and bitterly cold. My phone buzzed on the nightstand at 7 in the morning. Helen spoke with a brisk, urgent energy that instantly woke me up. The circuit court judge just signed the temporary order pending a prompt hearing, the attorney announced. The legal mandates were severe. The document immediately suspended the financial power of attorney, blocked any pending real estate transactions, preserved all disputed bank accounts, and appointed a temporary, independent fiduciary to take control. The order already existed. Now we had to make sure Brittany could never claim she acted without knowing about it. The process server tried her apartment and her corporate office twice yesterday, but she was entirely unavailable, Helen continued, the sound of rustling papers echoing through the receiver. We can serve her at the reception, I suggested, watching the morning rain streak my bedroom window glass. I want to wait until after the ceremony, so Mom does not get traumatized in the middle of a crowded church. Helen let out a heavy sigh, and the sharp tone of her voice made my stomach drop. Lauren, we do not have time to be polite. I just received a tip from the title company. Your sister flies out for her honeymoon on Sunday morning, and she booked a remote online notarization appointment for Monday morning. She plans to execute the electronic real estate closing from her resort. The reality of the timeline crashed over me. Helen had already sent certified copies of the order to the title company and the financial institutions identified in the filing. Serving Brittany at the hotel would not create the order's authority. It would prove she had actual notice before leaving Virginia, prevent her from claiming ignorance, and stop her from carrying the certified power of attorney documents to another closing agent. The reception was the last place we knew with certainty she would remain long enough to be served. I stood before my bedroom mirror, smoothing the navy blue fabric of my dress. The garment was 4 years old, the hem reinforced with careful, painstaking stitches I had placed there myself. I did not look like a woman about to dismantle a life of carefully crafted lies, but I felt the weight of the court order resting in my bag, tucked alongside my mother's medication schedule and the contact information for our independent caregiver. I smoothed my hair one final time, checked that the emergency contact folder was secure, and walked out to the car where Tessa waited to drive us to the Roanoke Grand Hotel. The ballroom inside the hotel was blindingly bright. Chandeliers glittered like frozen ice above the dance floor, and the air smelled overwhelmingly of expensive floral arrangements and desperate ambition. Brittany moved through the crowd like she owned the very oxygen we were breathing, her silk gown rustling against the expensive carpet. Every time a guest complimented her, she leaned in to whisper something that made them glance toward me with pity or mild disdain. My attire, modest and recycled, stood in stark contrast to the opulence she had funded with our mother's stolen security. Daniel found me near the refreshment table. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, though he seemed frazzled by the sheer scale of the event. He handed me a glass of champagne, his smile tight. "Everyone is asking why you and Brittany are not speaking," Daniel said, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. I looked at him, searching for even a flicker of awareness. "Did you ever wonder why your wedding gift came through a construction company account, Daniel?" The groom laughed, though it sounded forced. Brittany explained that. Margaret insisted on paying for the ballroom. She wanted to be involved, Lauren. Do not turn this into some weird, bitter fight over money when she just wants to be generous. He truly did not know. He was a man who believed the script he was handed because the alternative was too ugly to consider. I set the untouched glass back down on the table, my heart heavy. He was not a villain, just a man who had chosen the easiest version of the truth. Tessa caught my eye from across the room. She had successfully guided Mom to a quiet seating area near the kitchen entrance, far away from the crushing noise and the inevitable disaster. Margaret looked tired, her hands fluttering aimlessly, but she was safe and away from the center of the chaos. Brittany stepped up to the microphone just as the music swelled to a crescendo. The room went silent. She looked radiant, powerful, and entirely certain of her future. As the groom's family watched, she launched into a toast about the unwavering support she had provided our mother, positioning herself as the saintly daughter who had sacrificed everything. She capped off the speech by turning her head and spotting me standing near the side exit. "Some people in this family are just too poor to understand the value of loyalty," she said into the microphone, her voice dripping with poison. "Sit quietly, Lauren. Do not embarrass us further." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd. Daniel looked down, clearly uncomfortable, but the rest of the room seemed to enjoy the spectacle of my public humiliation. I felt the court order pressed against my side, a cold, sharp reminder of what was coming. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply pulled out my phone and dialed the number for Helen. "The process server is positioned at the rear exit," Helen said, her voice sounding crisp and clear over the hum of the ballroom. "Are you absolutely certain, Lauren?" I looked at my sister, who was currently raising her glass to the cheering crowd. I thought about the remote closing scheduled for Monday, the flight she planned to take tomorrow morning, and the mother she had treated as a bank account. "Serve her now," I said. I hung up the phone and stepped back into the shadows of the doorway. Outside in the hallway, the venue security guard was already signaling the process server to move. The music began to pulse again, but the rhythm felt off, jagged and tense. I stood perfectly still, watching my sister take a triumphant sip of her drink, completely unaware that the walls of her life were about to fall. The heavy oak doors began to creak open, and the music cut off, leaving only the sound of 100 people holding their collective breath as the man in the rumpled gray suit stepped onto the dance floor. The venue coordinator stepped toward the bandstand and signaled for the music to stop. The transition was jarring, a sudden vacuum where the heavy bass had been only seconds before. Security staff guided a man in a rumpled suit toward the center of the dance floor. He stood with the unshakable posture of someone who had delivered thousands of these envelopes, his gaze locked entirely on the woman in the silk gown. "Brittany Whitaker?" the man asked, his voice cutting clearly through the confused murmurs of 100 guests. My sister tilted her head, her smile faltering just enough to show the cracks in her mask. "Yes?" The man held out the thick manila envelope. "You are being served with a temporary order from the circuit court." Brittany took the documents, her fingers trembling against the stiff paper. She pulled out the first page, scanning the formal header, and the color drained from her face until she looked like a marble statue. She looked up at the man, then toward me, and finally at Daniel, who stood frozen in total disbelief. "This is a mistake," she whispered, her voice climbing in pitch. "Lauren, what did you do?" She started to shake the pages at the room, her composure disintegrating into frantic gasps. "She froze my accounts. That money was mine. My mother insisted I take it." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Guests exchanged panicked glances, some backing away from the bridal party, as if the disgrace were contagious. My sister kept shouting, her words weaving a confession that proved she saw our mother's assets as her personal property. I did not move to interrupt. I simply watched, my heart rate steady, my attention fixed on Mom, who sat safely in the distant corner with Tessa. "Brittany, what is she talking about?" Daniel asked, his voice hollow. "What accounts?" My sister did not answer him. She just screamed, a raw, high sound that scraped against the rafters, and ran toward the service exit. Aunt Carol rushed forward, her hands raised as if she could physically hold the scattered legal pages together. "This is a private family misunderstanding. Everyone, please, continue the dinner." I walked onto the dance floor, my movements slow and deliberate. "It is not a misunderstanding, Carol. It is a court order based on documented fraud." I did not offer a speech. I did not need to shout. After delivering those words, I turned my back on the wreckage and walked straight to my mother, placing a firm, protective hand on her shoulder. The fight was far from finished, but the veil of the perfect daughter had been permanently shredded in front of everyone who mattered to her. Daniel appeared at my side several minutes later. His tuxedo jacket looked disheveled. He handed me a folder he had plucked from the bridal carry-on bag, his face pale with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. "She asked me to grab her passport from the luggage in the bridal suite," Daniel said, his eyes unfocused. "This was tucked right inside the zipper. I do not even know what I am looking at." I opened the folder. It contained a draft settlement statement, a schedule for a remote closing appointment on Monday morning, and an acknowledgement page with a signature that looked nothing like my mother's handwriting. The documents were dated for a time when Mom had been undergoing memory testing at the clinic. It was not a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a planned liquidation. Daniel looked at the pages, realized the implication of the closing schedule, and then took out his phone to photograph every single sheet. He sent the files directly to Helen's email address, his hands steadying as the betrayal finally crystallized into rage. I looked at the closing packet and understood the full scale of the gamble. The wedding was never the goal. It was simply a pit stop before she fled the state to finalize the theft of our mother's home. My sister had bet everything on the idea that nobody would dare to look at the paperwork. She was wrong. The reality of the situation now sat in Daniel's phone, waiting for a forensic expert to expose the forgery. Helen called my phone while I was guiding Mom toward the exit. The attorney's voice sounded victorious. I already sent the certified order to the title company and lender. The proof of service now confirms Brittany had actual notice. Daniel's packet identified every closing contact and document, and the title company has canceled Monday's appointment. I hung up the phone and stepped out into the crisp, cold Roanoke night. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and black under the streetlights. My sister was currently hiding somewhere in that hotel, her reputation burned to the ground and her legal power stripped away. I did not feel the triumph I had expected. I only felt a deep, quiet relief that the long, exhausting masquerade was finally over. The truth was exposed, and for the first time in years, the path forward belonged to us. The months following that disastrous wedding felt like a slow, meticulous deconstruction of a lie. I returned to my life, balancing the new full-time role at the hospital with the quiet, steady rhythm of my mother's care. Every afternoon, I checked in with Tessa, ensuring the medication schedule remained unbroken, while Helen navigated the increasingly complex legal landscape. A forensic accountant eventually untangled the messy web of finances. By the time he finished his final report, the total amount missing was $148,000. The invoices for the imaginary bathroom renovations had been meticulously traced back to the defunct cleaning business Aunt Carol once owned. The money flowed from our mother's accounts into Carol's company, only to be redirected into my sister's pockets and the bank accounts of various luxury wedding vendors. The scale of the theft was breathtaking in its arrogance. Aunt Carol eventually opted to cooperate with the authorities in a desperate bid to reduce her own liability. Through her defense attorney, Carol surrendered her mobile phone and the box of folders she had stolen from my den to investigators as part of her cooperation agreement with prosecutors. In her recorded interview with investigators, Carol admitted the company records had been used as a conduit to make the transfers look legitimate. She also stated that Brittany had promised her a share of the house sale proceeds in exchange for her silence and cooperation. Helen finally showed me the full string of messages recovered from those devices. I sat in her office, reading through the history. There were exchanges where Brittany discussed how she would replace the missing money once the property sold, clearly demonstrating that she knew the funds were gone. In one exchange, Carol questioned what I might do if I caught on. Brittany's response was chilling. She dismissed me as a bitter, jealous woman who was far too poor to ever pose a real threat. It was the same script she had used at the wedding, a narrative of manipulation they had spent years refining. The documents Daniel turned over provided the final, undeniable proof. He provided the email thread regarding the generous wedding gift, the vendor contracts, and the clear photographic evidence of the closing packet he had found inside the carry-on luggage. Daniel filed for divorce within 2 weeks of the wedding, effectively severing every connection he had to the fraud. He reached out to apologize once, but I did not offer forgiveness. Some betrayals were too deep to be mended by a simple word. The criminal proceedings moved with the slow, grinding weight of the justice system. Brittany faced multiple charges, including financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and grand larceny. The prosecutors also piled on forgery and uttering because of the falsified documents used to facilitate the theft. During the pre-trial hearings, my sister continued to insist that she had only borrowed the money, maintaining that she intended to pay it back eventually. It was the defense of a child caught stealing from a cookie jar, not a professional manager who had systematically drained an elderly woman's life savings. As the months stretched toward the final sentencing, Brittany's defense team tried to paint me as an opportunistic daughter who had orchestrated the entire exposure to seize the family home. I did not engage in the media back and forth or offer interviews to anyone. I simply kept my records clean, kept my work consistent, and focused on providing a stable environment for my mother. The truth did not require an audience. It only required a courtroom. The morning of the sentencing, the air in the courthouse felt thin and sterile. Brittany sat at the defense table, wearing a plain gray suit that made her look years older than her 33 years. She refused to look at me, keeping her eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Her lawyers spent nearly an hour presenting mitigating factors, pleading for a lighter sentence by focusing on her lack of a prior criminal record and her professional background. I watched her shoulders tense as the judge began to speak. The recommendation for a lighter sentence hovered in the air, a suggestion that might have kept her out of a cell. The judge studied the forensic report, flipping through the evidence of the luxury ballroom event and the fraudulent real estate closing papers. She looked down at my sister, her expression hardening. "You did not borrow from your mother," the judge said, her voice echoing in the packed room. "You built a luxury event on her inability to protect herself. Stand up." The room seemed to vanish. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity, a sense of finality that had been missing for so many months. The judge did not stop there, but the sound of her voice became a distant hum as I realized the masquerade was finally, truly over. Brittany clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white, and for the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. The story she had told the world, the story where she was the golden child and I was the bitter, poor failure, had been replaced by the cold reality of the ledger I had kept for all those years. Every decision she had made had led to this single moment of total public collapse. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing myself to hear the final judgment that would define the rest of our lives. The gavel sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Brittany was sentenced to 3 years of active incarceration for her crimes, a term that reflected the calculated, predatory nature of her choices. The judge also imposed 2 years of post-release supervision and a strict order to provide full restitution to our mother. A permanent injunction stripped my sister of any legal authority to act as a fiduciary for anyone ever again. The courtroom was a sea of gray stone and muted whispers as bailiffs moved to secure the prisoner. Brittany did not look at me. She kept her chin high, her expression frozen in that familiar practiced mask, but the shaking in her hands betrayed her. She was finally facing the consequences of her own handiwork. Aunt Carol received a significantly lighter sentence due to her cooperation with the state, but her life in the community was effectively over. She was sentenced to home confinement and a lengthy period of supervised probation. Beyond the legal penalties, she faced the total loss of her family's respect and a mountain of debt from the restitution orders. She sat behind the defense table, weeping softly, her gray hair looking thin and brittle in the harsh courtroom lights. I felt no joy watching her unravel. I only felt a cold sense of justice finally balancing the scales. The fallout outside the courthouse was immediate. My sister was terminated from her corporate position following an internal investigation into her unethical conduct. Her professional reputation, once the foundation of her entire identity, disintegrated under the weight of the felony convictions. Daniel finalized his divorce shortly thereafter, cutting all ties to the wreckage. The lavish wedding had not been a step toward a high-status future. It had been a bright, expensive marker of her downfall. She had traded her family and her integrity for a ballroom rental and a week at a resort. And now, she had absolutely nothing left to show for it. Margaret was moved into a professional managed care facility under the oversight of an independent fiduciary appointed by the court. The house remained in Mom's name, saved from the forced sale that would have left her homeless. I visited her on Tuesday afternoons, sitting with her while she watched the birds at the feeder outside her window. Sometimes she called me by my name, and sometimes she just held my hand and smiled at the sunlight on the floor. I was no longer her primary caregiver, the gatekeeper, or the one responsible for every single failure of her mind. I was just her daughter again, and the peace in that realization was worth every sleepless night I had endured. The following month, I finally walked into my own townhouse. It was small, located near the hospital where I worked, and filled with sunlight. I moved my furniture into the living room, including the heavy black notebook that had served as the physical anchor for my truth for so many years. Placing the care ledger into a storage box in the back of my closet, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The era of documenting the sins of others was over. I had earned the right to build a life that did not center on my mother's decline or my sister's malice. A few family members reached out to offer weak, hollow apologies, some even trying to dismiss the entire nightmare as a mere misunderstanding. I did not raise my voice, and I did not let them talk over me. It was not a misunderstanding, I told them one by one. It was a choice. A choice repeated every single day for 18 months. I kept my boundaries firm. I did not cut them off out of anger, but I refused to let them pretend that what had happened was anything less than a profound moral failure. They were not permitted to use the word family to demand my silence anymore. I stood in my new kitchen, the morning light pouring across the freshly polished wood floors. My phone buzzed on the counter, a reminder about my first full day of work at the new hospital department. I checked my bank account, looking at the balance in the next chapter's savings account. It was nearly empty after the security deposit and the first month of rent. But the emptiness did not scare me at all. The money had accomplished its singular purpose. It had purchased me a door that I held the only key to, a space where I was finally the primary authority. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. The world was quiet and entirely my own. For years, they had called my sacrifice poverty, using my humble choices as a weapon to make me feel small. The truth had been much simpler. I had been paying for everyone else's comfort while slowly erasing my own existence. The day I stopped paying was the day my own life finally began. I took a deep breath, filled my lungs with the clean morning air, and stepped forward into the rest of my life. You might think that protecting your family means swallowing every bitter pill they hand you, believing that if you just sacrifice enough, you can keep the peace. You may have spent years playing the role of the quiet, reliable one, the daughter who always shows up, while others are allowed to drift through life on your labor and your silence. If you are standing there right now, feeling like you are perpetually paying for everyone else's comfort while your own life remains on permanent hold, take this as your sign to stop. The lesson here is not that you should be cruel, but that true love is never an invitation to be exploited. Being the responsible one does not mean you have to be the martyr. You have to realize that when you enable behavior that is destructive to the vulnerable, you are not keeping the family together. You are simply subsidizing the rot that will eventually bring everything down anyway. It is easy to believe the lies they tell you about yourself, that you are too sensitive, too jealous, or simply not as capable as the golden child who wears success like a designer accessory. But you know the truth of your own labor, and you know the weight of the burdens you have been carrying in the dark. You are not required to hold up the ceiling while they burn the floor. You must learn to document the reality you see, to trust your own senses when they try to gaslight you, and to build a life that stands on its own foundation. There is no nobility in being the only person who holds the truth while everyone else pretends the damage does not exist. You deserve a space where you are not the backup plan, the safety net, or the scapegoat for people who would rather sell your future than face their own limitations. It takes courage to stop being the one who makes everything work. But the moment you decide that your own well-being is not negotiable is the moment you reclaim your power. You have the right to set boundaries, to walk away from conversations that diminish you, and to prioritize the reality of your own life over the carefully curated performance of those who depend on your silence. Now, ask yourself, what is the single biggest burden you are currently carrying that was never yours to bear in the first place? If you let that weight go today, what kind of life would you actually start building for yourself?